In 1982, the British Army took part in a 72-day campaign to retake the Falkland Islands, a British overseas territory in the South Atlantic. Whilst never officially declared, the conflict, which became known as the Falklands War, was a significant moment in the recent history of the British Armed Forces. It was a conflict fought far from home, in often challenging conditions, and it had a profound impact on all of those involved. Here at the National Army Museum and at military museums around the country, people work to preserve and capture the stories of the soldiers who served in the conflict for posterity. We've drawn on the unique collections of the National Army Museum, the Guards Museum, the Airborne Assault Museum, and the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers Museum, as well as the Household Cavalry Regiment, to showcase some of the powerful testimonies and fascinating objects that have been preserved for the public. They all tell deeply personal stories of some of the people who served in the Falklands War. On the 2nd of April 1982, Argentine forces launched a surprise invasion of the Falkland Islands, and the British Army found itself quickly preparing for war. Strategic thinking at the time was dominated by the threat from Soviet forces. Now, soldiers were fighting a war 8,000 miles from home, with equipment and tactics designed for the plains of Europe. Kit had to be found, maps had to be drawn up, and soldiers were called upon to be deployed. The remote location meant many servicemen had never even heard of the Falkland Islands. Troops soon embarked on a long journey down to the South Atlantic, departing from ports across the UK. They travelled aboard requisitioned ocean liners like the SS Canberra and the QE2.
We sailed out of Southampton Harbour with bands playing and women crying and crowds cheering. And it was a straight lift in many respects from that scene from The Four Feathers, where you see the troops marching to the dockside. And we didn't quite march to the dockside, we went down 55-seater coaches and shambled in rather more sort of disorganised manner up the brow onto the thing. The Marines, because we were there, had this formal drill where at a set point we were given the order to line the rail. So one moment there was nobody on the deck, and the next moment the whole ship's rail was lined with Marines and paratroopers. So we were all out there, and all the families were on the dockside, and the bands of the Parachute Regiment and the Royal Marines were playing sort of suitable things. And I remember as we slipped away from the quayside, berth 106 at Southampton Water, the band was playing, our band was playing Rod Stewart, We Are Sailing, which was current because about a year before they'd done that series on the old Ark Royal. So it was a very topical piece. Of course, Rod Stewart had taken it into the chance as well. So we slipped out just at last light. And we thought, as we disappeared, the quayside disappeared, that was it. And then we got to the public space at Southampton, and that just went wild. This wall of noise hit the side of the ship, which was the general public cheering us out to sea. But we then settled down into a routine of training, but we did train hard. The upper deck was a 400-metre racetrack, anything up to 10 miles, getting dizzy on a 400-metre circuit, carrying 35 pounds of kit, helmet and weapon. We did a lot of weapon training, usually dry drills, but occasionally we were allowed to check zero by shooting at things that were floated off the back of the ship. A lot of radio training. And we improvised. We did house clearing drills by working our way down lines of cabins. You'd hoof a door in of a cabin, shout grenade and lob an orange in. That created lots of mirth.
I remember seeing the QE2 and I thought what a wonderful way to go to war. At the time, I was in a cabin with two other artillery captains. I elected to sleep on the floor, which was a good move because the beds were so softly sprung that when we started to hit some of the rough seas later on, it was uncomfortable. They were rolling out of the beds. Certainly the facilities on board, I can remember going to the shop and buying up all their tins of Nivea to give to my team to smear over their faces as some sort of protection against the cold.
Conditions in the Falkland Islands were tough. Winter in the Southern Hemisphere was cold, wet and brutal. 2 and 3 Para, alongside their comrades from the Royal Marines, were living a challenging existence. Their frontline trenches and foxholes were dug into the crags and peat of the mountains around San Carlos, the site of the first British landings on the 21st of May. As British forces began their advance, medics and airmen stationed behind the front line found shelter from the weather amongst abandoned buildings and rusting huts.
Apparently that winter we were there was the worst they'd had for years, so the locals told me. The infantry lived in holes in the ground or in little shelters in the rocks, etc. Their living conditions were quite atrocious. And the medical problems you get as a byproduct of that, foot rot or trench foot exposure and things were quite significant. In comparison, we had a very, very luxurious time because we lived in an abandoned wooden garage at Fitzroy, and we actually lived in a derelict house at Goose Green. So the comparison between the way we lived when we weren't actually involved in dangerous things was incredible. It's like chalk and cheese. Occasionally we had running water. It ran through the ceilings and ran through the walls. So our living conditions were luxurious compared to the infantry.
Living conditions weren't the only issue. The sinking of the cargo ship Atlantic Conveyor early in the conflict destroyed all but one of the British heavy-lift Chinook helicopters, designed to transport soldiers and equipment. With their loss, there was no other option but to cross the tough terrain of the islands on foot. The Paras and the Royal Marines covered over 50 miles in just 3 days, whilst carrying around 50 kilos of equipment. A Bergen carried by a member of the 2nd Battalion, the Scots Guards, during the conflict is on display at the National Army Museum, highlighting the mental and physical challenge that British soldiers endured.
Soldiers have to go back to do what their dad has done, what their granddad has done, what their great-granddad has done, and put it all on their back and march across to wherever they're going to go. Then you get terms like yomp, which is a Royal Marine piece of slang, and TAB, Tactical Advance to Battle, which enter the vernacular because they're having to do this kind of relatively old-fashioned piece of soldiering. And interestingly, we start seeing even things like First World War diseases like trench foot start making a resurgence. But because they're professional British soldiers and they've been well-trained, they cope with it and they get themselves to where they need to be.
And what was the terrain like that they were walking over?
It's pretty broken, it's bad. So we've got a lot of exposed rocks, there's peat tufts, there's gorse, it's like walking over moorland, and it's pretty slippery as well. You're carrying an enormous amount of kit, you're carrying all of your full pack. Now, throughout history, British soldier, any soldier, but mainly British soldiers, has been carrying an average about 75 pounds. So if you look at a knight in full armour, roughly 75 pounds. Napoleonic soldier, First World War soldier, about 75 pounds. Guys in the Falklands carrying about 110 pounds. So because you've got no supply line to get you there, you've got to carry it all yourself. So it's about another 50 kilograms. Now, gentlemen shouldn't ask, Isabel, but roughly how much do you weigh?
Around that size.
About 50. So there you go. Think about that then. So in the Falklands campaign, average soldiers carrying one of you to get into battle.
In a lot of the photos of the Falklands War, the troops are wearing their berets. Why is this?
Well, they're not wearing their Mark IV battle bowlers. There are lots of reasons why. One is that these were actually designed to protect you from shell fire from artillery strikes. These were originally introduced in 1944 for D-Day beach assault, so they're getting pretty outdated. They're heavy, they're quite uncomfortable. The long scoop at the back here, if you lay on the ground and try to operate your rifle, that impacts into your pack and knocks you off. So not great. The other thing is that they are very similar to the helmets that the Argentine soldiers are wearing. So you've got a very similar silhouette. So you get a bit of blue on blue. And by blue on blue, I mean you shoot your own guys. For all of those reasons, they actually decided that they would wear their personnel berets. And as I say, the lot of the kit that they're getting, although it's good stuff, it is getting to the end of its service life. So helmets, this SLR rifle, this is actually an early FN version. This has been around since the 50s too. It's a great piece of kit, but it could potentially be improved. And there are issues with this one in that British versions of this weapon are governed so you can only fire a short burst of ammunition from it. The Argentine soldiers are using exactly the same weapon, but theirs is fully automatic. So that's quite desirable. So British soldiers are trying to grab that. And we mentioned that they're using a carrying system, carry a lot of kit. Well, they're using what's called the 58 pattern, which indicates it was originally patterned in 1958. So it's been around a long time. All of this kit has been around a long time. And within a very few short years, this is going to become a Kevlar pot. This one is going to go over to the SA-80, and we've been moving it to nylon for our carrying system.
We made one fundamental error, which I think most of us now agree with,
we took much too much kit. The climb up to Sussex Mountain, in the knowledge or in the fear that we might not see the boat again, and that therefore we could take everything that could be useful to us with us in our Bergens, was a staggering exercise, literally. The SAS had warned us of the tufts of peat turfs that existed there, which were bloody to walk on. In order to make sure, because there were no guns ashore at that stage, that we had indirect fire support on Sussex Mountain, we each had to carry 1 or 2 mortar bombs, I think 1 mortar bomb each, to a base plate, which was 2 or 3 kilometres inland from where we came ashore. And that, plus a full Bergen, plus probably 50 pounds anyway around your waist in terms of belt order, was a grim ordeal for most of us.
The final days of the conflict saw British forces engage in a series of assaults on the Argentine positions in the hills around the capital, Port Stanley. One of the key battles saw the Scots Guards launch a frontal attack on Mount Tumbledown on the night of the 13th into the morning of the 14th of June. Argentine defences were anchored on this feature, and it was the final key to unlocking the approaches to Stanley. The mountain is over 1,000 feet high, and in the face of gale-force winds and snow, the men scrambled over the rocky outcrops under heavy fire. In the fierce fighting that followed, some British troops were forced to use their bayonets to drive Argentine defenders from their positions. 11 hours later, as the sun rose in the sky, the Guards had successfully secured Tumbledown. The road to Stanley was open. A truly extraordinary set of objects that tell the story of this hard-fought battle can be seen at the Guards Museum in London. They provide a powerful insight into the realities of combat during the war.
So this is a 58 pattern pouch and a brass military compass. It was worn by Major John Keasley, left flank company commander Scots Guards at the Battle of Tumbledown. He was wearing on his belt round his waist. His company had just charged into an Argentinian position. He'd led a bayonet charge. They'd cleared out the position. They were just consolidating themselves when the Argentinians counterattacked. A machine gun fire ripped across the clearing. He was hit in the stomach and felt the impact of a bullet. By luck, the bullet had hit this heavy compass. It had gone through the pouch into the compass, making this hole, shattering the compass. If that had gone anywhere else, it would have injured him or killed him. It was by pure luck that he was wearing it where he was. And it goes to show, more than anything else, that a few matters of centimetres are life and death for a soldier. As it was, he survived the battle and he was awarded the Military Cross for his bayonet charge.
Soldiers who experience battle have all gone through an important experience in their lives, and they all process that differently. And you've got a great musical example here at the museum.
That's correct. This is an original music score written at the time of the Battle of Tumbledown. The attack on Tumbledown ended at dawn with British victory, and the Scots Guards consolidated their positions on the hill. They looked down into Port Stanley, and news came through that the Argentinians had surrendered and the war was over. Later that day, as the Guards dealt with their casualties and dug into that position, the haunting sound of bagpipes played out across the summit of the battlefield. And this is the original score for the tune that was played that day. It was written by Scots Guards Pipe Major James Jimmy Riddle, who was behind the lines at the battle. It's not written on paper, but it's actually written on the cardboard from a ration pack, as this is all he had to hand at the time. He wanted to commemorate his comrades who died in the battle, and having written it, he then climbed up to the battlefield summit and played the tune on the bagpipes that he'd taken with him into the front line.
When the battle was over, it was a great relief. Very, very tired, cold, shivery, sad, elated slightly. They had moments of elation. The old emotions were really up and down, from elation to depression and all the rest of it, but you can't show it. You've got to be steely-eyed and all the rest of it. You want to go away for a cry somewhere. Can't do that either. It's not permitted. It's not macho. You do that in dark corners when no one's looking. And a lot of people don't admit things like that because it's unmasculine. It's total tosh. Of course, it's just as masculine as anything else. The macho man is normally a brittle man and you break. But they've got to have emotions. And they've got to show them as well. But it doesn't do to show emotions in front of a whole heap of soldiers who've just been involved in traumatic things as well.
Argentine forces surrendered on the 14th of June 1982, effectively ending the conflict. British troops had captured 11,400 Argentine prisoners, along with their equipment. It took a month for all the prisoners to be returned home. Soldiers from regiments including the Royal Engineers, the Royal Army Medical Corps, and the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers set to work completing tasks as varied as rebuilding roads and jetties, fixing the water supply, building cemeteries, and clearing waste and rodents. The impact on the Falkland Islands themselves was stark. It is estimated that 30,000 mines were laid by Argentine forces during the conflict, affecting an area equating to 28,800 football pitches. The very last of these mines was finally cleared at the end of 2020, 38 years after the war ended. In the years following the conflict, many soldiers held on to objects that would help mark their time on the islands and allow family members to connect with their experiences. On display at the Airborne Assault Museum at Duxford are a set of highly personal objects brought back from the islands, which have a surprising story to tell.
So in my hands, I actually have the battle helmet owned and used by General Menendez. And of course, General Menendez was the commander in charge of the invasion of the Falkland Islands in 1982. As you can see inside, he's actually written his name and rank inside there. And on the outside of this helmet, he had this rubber band that fitted on the outside, and tucked into this band is even his original field dressing, which, as you can see, is all written in Spanish on there. So that would have sort of fitted on the side of his helmet like that, and should he ever need it in some emergency. Now, this helmet has quite an interesting story. So we were donated this helmet by a member of 3 Para who was guarding prisoners of war at Port Stanley just after the battle. And he was approached by an Argentinian soldier, and this chap was actually of Welsh descent. He was an Argentinian living in Patagonia, and he picked up the helmet and he handed it to his guard, member of 3 Para. And this chap from 3 Para kept it for all these years until we got a phone call from him saying, "I've got General Menendez's battle helmet. Would you like to have it on display?" And of course, what a wonderful addition. And what a personal addition too to our display. Along with a couple of other very personal items to General Menendez. So here we have his map he used in the invasion of the Falklands. As you can see, in blue are the Argentinian positions, and then in red are the British positions here, and the ones in green are the artillery positions. We also have the General's actual cap. So you can see it has the Argentinian blue and white roundel there. So we're very fortunate with our displays here at Airborne Assault that not only have we got wonderful personal items of the British Airborne Forces who fought with at the Falklands conflict, but also we have these wonderful personal objects from the other side, the Argentinian soldiers' side as well.
Relics of the Falklands War, both large and small, continue to connect serving personnel with the actions of their forebears. A rare survivor of the conflict has been recently restored by soldiers of the Blues and Royals at Bulford Camp in Wiltshire.
So this is an AML-90 Panhard. It's made by the French and then sold to the Argentinians around 1978. It was then deployed with 11 others to the Falkland Islands in 1982.
And you've done quite a restoration job. What's that involved?
So this vehicle spent its last 40 years as a gate guard. A gate guard being a vehicle that's left service or a war trophy that's on display outside a military establishment. Unfortunately, it has not survived the weather very well. It was not in a good state. So what we've done is we've conducted a cosmetic refurb, neutralised all the rust on the inside, and made it look presentable again, ready for the commemorations of the 40th of the Falklands.
Why has it been so important to the regiment that it's been a gate guard?
So from the Household Cavalry Regiment, 2 troops of the Blues and Royals, B Squadron, 3 and 4 troop, deployed to the Falkland Islands with 4 Scimitars, 4 Scorpions and 1 Samson, all part of the CVRT family, which stands for Combat Vehicle Reconnaissance Tract, where they landed with the first wave on the 21st of May in Port San Carlos with the Marines and the Paras, and they followed them across the island and then took part in one of the first elements into Port Stanley, where all 12 Panhards were, or all surviving 12 Panhards were abandoned, and 2 were then captured, brought back to the UK, 1 living in the Tank Museum and 1 that you see here now still belonging to the regiment.
For serving soldiers like yourself, why has it been so important to remember this story?
It's a very good question. So the restoration project is a good team building exercise. It's also really good to teach the soldiers on regimental history as well. For example, the members from C Squadron that we had helping were unaware it was a Falklands War trophy and were very interested when they discovered it was and really got stuck into the project. It symbolises soldiers from the regiment that took part in the conflict. It's a good reminder of lessons that were learnt and perhaps lessons to look to the future to not to repeat. And it's just a good symbolisation of the past and the present and making sure that we preserve the history that we still have today.
Although the conflict lasted only a few months, both sides suffered significant casualties. Argentine forces lost 649 men, whilst British forces lost 255 men across all 3 services. 3 Falkland Islanders were also killed. Many British servicemen received medals for their immense courage during the conflict. One of the most famous is on display at the National Army Museum. It was awarded to Lieutenant Colonel Herbert H. Jones, commanding officer of 2 Para, for his actions at Goose Green, the site of the first major land battle between British and Argentine forces.
Jones was very much a lead from the front kind of guy. So he did that, he led from the front. And unfortunately, he didn't realise that he was outflanked by an Argentine machine gun position and he was cut down and killed. Now, interestingly, that inspired his guys to go forward and take the position. So for his action at Goose Green, Britain awarded Colonel Jones the Victoria Cross, which, as you know, is the highest award for valour that Britain awards to her armed service personnel.
And why is it so important that we have his medal set and particularly the Victoria Cross on display here at the museum?
Well, that is one of the most important stories that we tell. We're a whole series of important stories, and these objects are what allow us to tell them. So I think that Goose Green is one of those points that really crystallised in the British public's mind just how important and how dangerous this conflict was going to be. So we are enormously fortunate to be able to display this medal here at the museum because it allows us to tell that incredibly important story.
The Falklands War had a profound and immediate impact on culture and society back home in Britain. The experiences of servicemen were already being taken out of their hands as mythology began to build up surrounding the events of the conflict. The Guards Museum in London has recently acquired a striking example of the way in which the story of the war was being presented to children only a few months after its conclusion.
This is one of my favourite objects, actually. It's an edition of Battle comic from March 1983. And its cover story is Fight for the Falklands, which deals with the Guards' attack at Tumbledown. Battle was a comic aimed primarily at boys, and it dealt with stories of heroism and bravery, mainly from the Second World War, in a very graphic style, and was famously known for the cries of those being killed and wounded. Very graphic for children to see. What I find amazing about this is that within a few months of the end of the war, it's dealing with a contemporary conflict in exactly the same graphic style. bearing in mind that the war had occurred so recently, it's clearly seen as something popular and something that they think children will be interested in. If you think about the fact that its readership would have experienced their stories of Second World War through their grandparents, perhaps, this time they could experience it for themselves directly. I, for instance, was 9-year-old at the time, remember watching the war unfold on the news in the hotel lounge when we were on holiday. And at first it was a big adventure for us. But as the war went on, casualties progressed, particularly with the sinking of the Royal Navy ships. We could sense that the adults around us were growing very serious and very quiet about it. And even at that age, we appreciated that there was something very important going on here. It changed our perception of it.
As the distance between the present day and the Falklands War increases with time, it is important to preserve the stories of the soldiers who served in the conflict for future generations. Here, you've had a glimpse of the stories that have been captured by military museums who work hard to preserve the testimony and experience of veterans. We also learnt the hidden significance behind important and treasured objects. Together, these vital artefacts provide a unique glimpse into the reality of the Falklands War and its legacy.
I mean, one has to put the Falklands War into context, really. I mean, it was a very small war, but nevertheless, it was a war, and there are many of us who will be our only sort of true experience of it. But I think that one gets a sort of a quiet satisfaction out of it, that actually that, you know, you were called to go and do what you spent your adult life training for, and that, you know, you were basically called and you weren't found wanting.